You've read the methods. You know exactly how the study was built. You've read the results. You know exactly what was found, table by table, number by number. Now comes the section where the authors finally tell you what they think it all means. The discussion. This is the most persuasive section in the entire paper, and that's exactly why it's the most dangerous to read carelessly. Up until now, the paper mostly asked you to identify what was planned, what was measured, and what was found. The discussion is different. Here the authors argue, they interpret, they compare, they address weaknesses, and sometimes try to soften their impact, and they build toward a conclusion they want you to accept. Your job is not to absorb their argument, it's to check it against the evidence you already gathered yourself. There are 5 things you read for: whether the interpretation matches the data, how the findings compare to previous literature, whether the limitations are honestly addressed, whether the conclusion is proportionate to the evidence, and what the authors recommend you do with this information. The first thing you check is whether the interpretation matches the data. This is the single most important skill in this section. Go back to your notes from the results. You already know the actual numbers, the primary outcome, the secondary parameters, what the frequency tables revealed. Now read the opening of the discussion and ask, does this restatement match what I actually found? Authors sometimes summarize their own findings in a slightly more favorable light, rounding up, emphasizing the headline percentage, quietly skipping the frequency distribution that told a more complicated story. This is not necessarily dishonesty. It's natural narrative pressure. Every author wants their work to look meaningful. Your job is to notice the gap, if one exists, between the precise data you already read and the smoothed-over summary now in front of you. The second thing you check is how the findings compare to previous literature. A strong discussion places the new findings in context, agreeing with, improving upon, or contradicting earlier studies. This tells you whether the finding is a consistent pattern or an outlier standing alone. Apply a critical filter here too. Check whether the comparison is fair. Similar populations, similar follow-up periods, similar definitions of success. A favorable comparison built on studies with a much shorter follow-up or a more lenient definition of success isn't really a fair comparison, even though it reads smoothly. This is where cherry-picking can happen, not by fabricating evidence, but by choosing only the comparisons that make the study look strongest. Notice whether the authors cite studies that disagree with their findings, or whether every cited comparison happens to support their conclusion. The third thing you check is whether the limitations are honestly addressed. Every study has limitations. The question is not whether they exist, it's whether the authors acknowledge them clearly, or minimize and bury them. You already identified several limitations yourself while reading the methods. Check whether the authors mention the same ones or leave out exactly what you noticed. A pattern worth watching for, a limitation mentioned in one brief sentence, immediately followed by a reason it doesn't really matter. Although the sample size was small, the consistent trend suggests. Watch especially for the word although. It often signals the start of an attempt to soften a real limitation. Sometimes that reassurance is justified. Sometimes it's doing a lot of work to wave away a real problem. The fourth thing you check is whether the conclusion is proportionate to the evidence. Does the strength of the conclusion match the strength of the study design and the size of the effect found? A single-arm retrospective cohort with no control group cannot conclude that one treatment is better than another. It can only describe what happened in this group. A small pilot study cannot conclude a technique is broadly recommended for clinical practice. It can suggest the technique deserves further investigation. Watch for action words that exceed what the evidence supports. Proves, confirms, should be used, is superior to, when the study design can only support softer language, like suggests, is associated with, or appears promising in this population. This mismatch between confident language and limited evidence is one of the most common ways readers are misled, not by false data, but by an overconfident interpretation of accurate data. The fifth thing you check is what the authors recommend you do with this information. Many discussions end with clinical implications or suggestions for future research. Ask whether the recommendation follows logically from this specific study, or whether it's a broader opinion the study is simply being used to support. Future studies should investigate longer follow-up periods follows directly from a stated limitation, appropriate. Clinicians should now adopt this protocol as standard practice. Based on one retrospective cohort from a single center is a much bigger leap and deserves more scrutiny before you accept it. By the end of the discussion and conclusion, you should be able to answer 4 questions. Does the interpretation actually match the data in the results? Is the comparison to previous literature fair or selectively favorable? Are the limitations honestly addressed, including the ones you identified yourself? And is the final conclusion proportionate to what this specific study can actually support? If you can answer those 4 questions with confidence, you have done something most readers never do. You have evaluated the argument instead of simply accepting it. Next episode, we open the actual discussion and conclusion of Bucer 2012 and check every one of these 5 elements against the real text, sentence by sentence. Episode 10, the discussion and conclusion, Part 2, applied to a real study, how to read a scientific paper, dental depth.